Relax and listen to the voice.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Terrifying Tales, Volume 2. Please don't forget to like these videos and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you do get notifications when we put out a new video. Alright, here we go. There's supposedly a street in Oklahoma City called Carrie Place, where rumor has it a little girl named Carrie was murdered, and to this day, late at night, you can hear her ghost walking around or playing in the backyard. The story begins in the late 1950s when little Carrie stayed after school one evening to play on the swings. While playing there alone, she was spotted by a crazed man who was carrying an axe. He approached the little girl, but she managed to escape the insane man's evil clutches and ran down the street, screaming for help. The little girl ran from house to house, pounding on the doors and windows and begging the people inside to help her. Unfortunately, the residents were all too terrified to open their doors for the little girl, and the axe-wielding murderer chased her down and caught her just as she reached her own home. On her own front porch, little Carrie was murdered by the man with the hatchet. The killer allegedly chopped up her body and stuffed her remains inside of a big flower pot that stood outside of her front door. According to the legend, the white porch of little Carrie's house was completely covered in blood, and no matter how many times her parents washed and scrubbed it, the stains could not be removed. To add to the spookiness, little Carrie's body parts are said to be buried in the backyard of the Hatchet House, and the neighborhood was renamed Carrie Place in her memory. But shortly after the murder, something strange happened to every house on the block where the residents had ignored Carrie's desperate pleas for help as she fled from her killer. The people in those houses woke up one morning to find that their front porches had been painted red. People say that the porches were painted red by the ghost of little Carrie as a mark of their guilt in the girl's death. Today, people who have driven by the house in the daytime say that the area has an odd, creepy feeling, and the windows of the Hatchet House have carvings in the shutters in the shape of hatchets. They also say the school swing set has been seen swinging on its own ever since. People have even reported hearing the haunting screams of a young girl echoing in the moonlit street. Every Halloween, local children flock to the historic district of Carrie's Place, trying to find the notorious house with the hatchet cutouts on its shutters. They go from door to door, trick-or-treating, but when people open their doors, instead of saying, "Trick or treat," the kids ask, "Can little Carrie come out to play?" Julia and Geraldine were best friends, but they had very different personalities. Julia was brave and fearless, while Geraldine was shy and frightened of everything. It was late at night and the girls were having a sleepover at Geraldine's house because her parents were out of town. In fact, every time Geraldine's parents went out of town, they had a sleepover because Geraldine was nervous about sleeping alone in the house, even though she knew there was nothing to be afraid of. It was a big gloomy house, set way back from the road. When Julia arrived and rang the doorbell, Geraldine answered the door and ushered her inside. The girls changed into their nighties. Julia was wearing a beautiful silk nightgown. It was blood red and had a furry collar. Geraldine thought it was gorgeous and wished that she had had such a beautiful nightgown. The girls made some popcorn and settled down on the sofa to watch a scary movie. When it was over, Julia was tired, and Geraldine was a bit scared, so they decided to turn off the TV and go to bed. As they walked up the stairs, they got the strangest feeling that something was following them. They ran upstairs and slammed the bedroom door. Once on the safety of the other side of the door, they looked at each other and began to laugh at one another for being so silly. It was shortly after midnight and the two girls were lying in bed, chatting, and all of a sudden, they heard a faint noise from down below. It sounded like something was moving around down there. Scratch, scratch, scratch. They stopped talking and looked at each other, wide-eyed. There was an uneasy silence, and then they heard the noise again. It sounded like fingers scraping down a chalkboard. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Julia sat up in bed, listening intently. Geraldine hid her head underneath the covers. "It's only a cat," Julia whispered. "I'm gonna go down and see." "Don't," Geraldine begged. "Please don't leave me, Julia." "Don't be so childish," Julia snapped. "Whenever anything fun happens, you get the shivers down your spine." "Please," Geraldine whined. "If you're so frightened, I'll lock the door from the outside and take the key with me," Julia assured her. "That way no one can get in. I hope it's a burglar. I'll give him the fright of his life." Julia got out of bed and felt her way to the door in the darkness. She slipped out into the hallway and quietly closed the door behind her. Geraldine listened intently as she turned the key in the lock. She heard Julia's soft footsteps going down the stairs. Then she heard the noise again. It sounded to her like a knife being sharpened. Geraldine lay there in the darkness with the bedclothes over her head. She was sick with fear and trying to be as quiet as a mouse. All she could hear was the very stillness of the house. She wanted to call out Julia's name, but she didn't dare. Geraldine waited for what seemed like an eternity, and after a long silence, she heard the noise again. It seemed to be moving now. It sounded as if it were coming up the stairs, getting louder and louder. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Then it stopped. Geraldine thought she heard someone standing on the other side of the door. She heard the key turn in the lock and the door creaked open. "Julia?" she asked. "Julia, is that you?" She couldn't see a thing in the darkness, so she reached out with both hands. She reached out and she felt the soft silk nightgown. Then Geraldine reached up higher, and to her relief, she felt the furry collar. It must be Julia, she thought. But when she reached higher yet again, she felt something wet and warm, and then nothing else. There was nothing there. Nothing but a bloody stump where her friend's head had once been. Early the next morning, when Geraldine's mother and father returned home, they were shocked by what they found. Inside the front door, there was a large pool of blood, and a trail of blood drops led up the stairs. The frantic parents rushed upstairs, following the trail of blood that led to their daughter's room. When they opened up the door, the poor couple stood there, appalled at the loathsome sight that met their eyes. Julia's headless body was stretched out on the floor. They found Geraldine hiding in the closet. Her hair had gone white in places, and she was babbling and raving like a lunatic. She had gone completely insane. Later that day, the police found a confused man wandering around the countryside. He was dressed in a white hospital gown, and he had blood all over him. In his hand, he was clutching a bloody knife. It turned out that he was a homicidal lunatic, and just the night before, he had escaped from the local asylum. Ironically, that asylum became the very same asylum where Geraldine would spend the rest of her life. A young girl had just finished nursing school and started working in a new hospital. Although she loved her job as a nurse, she found it difficult to get along with the people that she worked with. They were mostly young doctors who had just finished medical school. Her biggest problem with them was that they delighted in pulling pranks on one another. She found it very difficult to live with them in the residence next to the hospital because they stayed up late at night and made too much noise. The nurse worked very long hours and needed all the sleep that she could get. Whenever she complained about their behavior, the mischievous doctors just laughed in her face and told her to shut her fat mouth. The nurse eventually had to report the young doctors to the hospital manager, and they got in all sorts of trouble. The doctors then began to really hate the nurse and spent days devising a plan to get revenge on her. Finally, one of the doctors came up with a really sick prank they could play on the nurse, and the others gleefully agreed to help. That night, they broke into the mortuary in the hospital basement and sawed the arm off of a corpse. After that, they then sneaked into the nurse's bedroom and put the severed arm underneath her bed covers. They placed it at the bottom of the bed so that when she lay down, her feet would touch it. Chuckling to themselves, they stood around in the hallway, waiting for the young nurse to go to bed. As the girl went into her bedroom, the doctors had to stop themselves from laughing out loud. The nurse was suspicious of their behavior, but she was too tired to care and went into her bedroom, closing the door behind her. The young men waited impatiently in the hallway for the nurse to find the severed arm in her bed, but nothing happened. There were no screams, no angry yells, nothing of the sort. Only silence. After a while, the doctors got fed up waiting around and decided to turn in for the night. They assumed that they had placed the severed arm too far down in the bed, and the nurse must not have noticed it. The next morning when they woke up, the doctors went to check on the nurse. Receiving no answer when they knocked on her door, they turned the handle, the door opened, and they went inside. The room seemed to be completely empty. The doctors searched around the nurse's bedroom, and when they finally opened the closet, they were greeted by a horrible sight. There lay the body of the nurse. Pieces of her hair had been pulled out of her head. She had scratches all over her face, and her eyes were rolled back into her head. The young woman's face looked as though it had aged 20 years overnight. And worst of all, sitting directly at her feet was the severed arm. The woman named Iskra was the doll lady. Our village was small, and we were not wealthy. We had fresh water, and we had enough to eat, but we didn't have much else. The boys in the village had a few wooden toys, like carts and horses and soldiers that were carved out by the fathers. But every little girl had a beautiful doll. Iskra made sure of it. Iskra's husband had been a farmer and the wealthiest man in the village until his heart gave out. Iskra had never given birth, but she loved the children of the village as if they were her own. On each girl's 6th birthday, Iskra would present them with a beautiful doll. The dolls were of the best quality, purchased from a faraway town, and she lovingly made the clothes herself. Every one of the girls loved their dolls, and they loved Iskra. It had been that way for many years, but it was not to stay that way. On her 6th birthday, little Claudia received her doll. It had a green dress and big glass eyes. She took it with her everywhere, as most of the girls did. Scarcely a week after her birthday, we were playing in the fields when Claudia collapsed. We carried her back to her parents as fast as we could. The doctor came and said that she had a powerful and dangerous fever. He was not wrong, for within a few days, the fever had claimed her life. Before the news of her death broke, Claudia's mother ran up to Iskra's house and hurled the doll at the door. She screamed and wailed and shrieked. She said that it was the doll that had made her daughter ill, that Iskra had put a wicked curse on it. Iskra opened the door and began crying. She was so upset at this accusation. Claudia's mother was led away by her husband. All the people in the village agreed that she was overcome with grief and had taken out her anger on Iskra. But I noticed that some of the adults were far less friendly towards Iskra from that moment on, despite what they said to us. A few months passed after that, and my sister Nika's birthday approached. Iskra had not been seen for a few days, and when my sister's birthday came, we knew why. Iskra presented her with the most beautiful doll I have ever seen. It had huge blue eyes, and she had made an elaborate blue gown for it. It seemed as if Iskra wanted to allay the fears of the village and show that she was a good person. This doll that she had spent so much time and effort on was her way of proving it. Exactly 2 weeks after her birthday, my sister Nika died of a fever. My father nearly went mad with grief. For 2 full days he sat indoors, just holding Nika's doll and weeping, and then he went to see Iskra. It was like watching Claudia's mother all over again. My father shrieked and swore and spat at her. He smashed the doll against Iskra's door and screamed that she was a witch, that she had cursed the dolls and made Nika die. Iskra wept and tried to protest her innocence. It fell on deaf ears. After a few minutes, my father was dragged away by the doctor, and Iskra went back into her house, just as before. This time, however, it did not end there. One by one, the villagers came and put the dolls Iskra had given them on her doorstep. I remember seeing them all sitting there in a pile, 20 years' worth of gifts, all given back. We never saw Iskra take them inside, but they were gone the next day. Iskra was never seen to leave her house again. I sometimes caught sight of her face in a window as she stared at the children playing outside. Her face had become pale and gaunt, and her eyes were wide and red from crying. She looked like the very embodiment of madness, and eventually we saw her face no more, and Iskra the doll lady was all but forgotten. Years passed and I left the village. I sometimes thought of Iskra with her staring red eyes, and I felt sorry for her. I never really believed that she had hurt anyone. I thought it was all just a coincidence, and that she had been unfairly accused by superstitious townfolk searching for a scapegoat. I still believe that. One summer, I received a letter from my father. The village well had dried up, and the remaining people were abandoning the village to move to a nearby town. I went back home to help my father move his things and to see the village one last time. As we packed the last of his belongings into a cart, I looked over at Iskra's house. There were holes in the roof, and the windows were cracked and broken. I asked my father what had become of Iskra. He said that he didn't know, and then finished with, he didn't care. She had not been seen since the day I watched her staring from the window all those years ago. Was Iskra dead? Did her body remain in the house, unburied? Nobody knew. I felt the strange feelings of sadness and loss. Even though the sun was setting and the light was fading, I set off towards Iskra's house. My father called for me to stop, saying that there was no point in going inside. I didn't listen to him. I had to know what happened to Iskra, perhaps even bury her remains if necessary. I felt in some way responsible, as if I should have spoken up in her defense when she was accused of causing the fever. But who would have listened to me back then? I was just a child. The door to Iskra's house opened with a firm push. It was quite dark inside. I could make out a layer of dust and cobwebs covering everything. There was a faint smell of rotting meat, but besides some chairs and a stove, there was nothing much of interest in the downstairs area. The smell became stronger as I climbed the stairs. I began to feel scared as I approached Iskra's dust-covered bed. In my heart, I knew that this was almost certainly where her remains were. She must have fallen ill and died in bed, just as Claudia and Nika had done. I was sure of it. But as I approached the bed, it became quite obvious that it was empty. The sheets were still folded neatly on top, and there was no sign of Iskra. Perhaps she had left the village. Maybe she sneaked out one night when no one was watching. I turned to go back downstairs when I happened to notice the ladder leading up to the attic. I looked up and I could see that the trapdoor was closed. I tested the ladder, which was still sturdy, and climbed up. The trapdoor opened easily. The smell was much worse in the attic. The last rays of daylight were shining through a hole in the roof, and as I looked around, my heart jumped. I could make out small faces dotted around the attic, but after just a quick moment, I realized that they, of course, belonged to Iskra's dolls. All of the dolls that Iskra had ever made and given away were stored here. As I walked the room, I could see them clearly. The years had not been kind to them. They were cracked and damaged, and their dresses were stained by the rain. At this point, I was beginning to become scared. I took a few more steps into the room and saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I turned, but there was nothing there. I took another step further and it happened again, and then I thought I heard a whispered voice, and I became very frightened. I decided to climb back down that ladder and leave the house, heading back towards my father. I turned back towards the ladder and was startled to see Iskra standing in front of me. She was a rotting corpse with wide, staring red eyes. She screamed in my face, an unearthly screech that shook me to the core. I screamed and scrambled past her, down the ladder, down the stairs and out the door. As I ran from the house, I could hear a screeching, giggling laugh. I ran back to the cart, and my father asked me what had happened. I was nearly choking from fear and could barely talk. We left the village immediately, and I didn't look back. An hour later, I was still shaking, and an hour after that, I could still smell the stench of rotting flesh. I eventually managed to tell my father what I had seen. He said that it was fine, said that it was just, and said that it was Iskra's punishment for killing the children, to be trapped between life and death. I still remain unconvinced. I heard the mad laughter that came from her desiccated skull. I wonder If driven mad by the false accusations, she had cheated death in order to someday wreak revenge on those who had wronged her. Or perhaps I'm being as paranoid and foolish as those who accused her of giving away cursed toys all those years ago. All I know for sure is what I saw with my own eyes. A creature that should have been long dead, but was very much alive. Now that I'm a grown man and have children of my own, I don't let them play with dolls. There were two young boys named Billy and Richie. Their parents had gone out for the night and left them in the care of a babysitter. Her name was Agnes, and the boys hated her. To them, she was fat and ugly and stank of sweat and cigarettes. They said that her butt was so big that her pink sweatpants looked like they might burst at any moment. "Time for bed," Agnes announced as soon as their parents left. "But our parents allow us to stay up until 11, Billy protested. "Well, your parents aren't here anymore," Agnes said. "I'm in charge, and what I say goes. Now stop arguing and go up to bed. Go on, get up to bed." "You're a really rotten babysitter," Richie moaned. "And you're a pair of really rotten children," Agnes retorted to that. The two boys stood their ground and refused to budge. "Okay then, if you won't go to bed, I've got a little surprise for you," Agnes said with a malicious grin. "Just something to, I don't know, cheer you up." "What is it?" Richie asked. "It's a bedtime story," she said. "A scary one. You want to hear it, don't you? You're not afraid, are you?" Even though they were young boys, they felt that they were having their masculinity challenged. "Of course not," Billy blurted out. "Tell us the story." Agnes got up and turned off the lights. When she sat back down, the couch groaned under her weight. The two boys sat down cross-legged on the floor, facing her. "All right," she said, clearing her throat. "In some towns, people don't lock their doors at night, but in this town, nobody goes to bed at night without making sure the doors and windows are locked up tight. There's a very good reason for that. It's because of Madman Stan. Nobody knows where he comes from, but they say he lives in the cemetery, sleeping among the tombstones. Madman Stan will settle for men and women, and he likes little girls very much. But more than anything else in the whole wide world, he likes little boys. They're his favorite. He takes his victims back to the cemetery. Nobody talks out loud about what he does with them, but I'm sure you can imagine. They're definitely never seen again. Some people who live near the graveyard say that they hear screams at night. Horrible screams. Plenty of people have seen him late at night, going from house to house, checking every window and trying every door, looking for the one that isn't locked. And when he finds one, in he goes. And that's why everybody locks their doors up tight. Now, like I said before, time for bed." "That's all?" Richie asked. "That's not a story." "You're right, it's not a story," said Agnes. "It's a warning. I want you to go straight to sleep, and if I hear so much as a peep out of either one of you, I'll unlock the front door so Madman Stan can get in." 10 minutes later, the two boys were lying in bed, wide awake and staring at the ceiling. The room was in complete darkness. It wasn't true, was it? Richie asked. Of course not, replied Billy. She was just trying to scare us. All of a sudden, the bedroom door flew open. The boys almost jumped out of their skin. Agnes was standing there in the doorway. What did I tell you about talking? She shouted. Just for that, I'm going to go unlock the front door. She slammed the bedroom door shut, leaving the boys in darkness once again. They lay in bed, finally feeling a bit scared, shivering and clutching their pillows. They listened to her heavy footsteps walking back down the stairs. It's your fault, Billy whispered. Why did you have to go and open your big mouth? I'm sorry, Billy, whispered Richie. Now she's gone and unlocked the door, Billy whispered. You said you didn't even believe in Madman Stan, hissed Richie. Well, I don't. Well, then what are you so scared of? I'm not scared. It's just, shut up before she comes back, said Billy. The boys lay there in silence, staring at the ceiling. They tried to fall asleep, but they couldn't relax. Not with the front door open. All they could think of was Madman Stan coming to get them and dragging them off to the graveyard, where he would do unspeakable things to them. Billy got out of bed. His heart was beating fast. He eased open the bedroom door and peered through the crack. The coast was clear. Where are you going? Richie asked. I'm going to lock the front door, Billy replied. He slipped out into the hallway and crawled down the stairs as quietly as possible. When he got to the bottom, he tiptoed around the corner and checked the front door. It was locked. Agnes had been lying. She didn't unlock the front door after all. Billy got down on all fours and crawled down the hallway. When he came to the living room, he peered around the edge of the doorway. The television was off. Agnes was lying on the couch. He could see her butt. That big mound of pink lay there like a beached whale. He inched forward until he could see her face. Her eyes were shut and her mouth was hanging open. She didn't make a sound. She wasn't moving at all. He couldn't tell if she was asleep or dead. Hours later, after Billy had returned upstairs and fallen asleep, the boys were awakened by the sound of banging on their bedroom door. All of a sudden, the door burst open, and they both let out terrified screams. Their father was standing in the doorway. He quickly flipped on the light switch. "It's okay," he shouted. "They're in here." Their mother suddenly appeared in the doorway, breathing a sigh of relief. "What's going on, boys?" their father asked. "When we came home, the front door was wide open. Where's the babysitter? There's no sign of Agnes anywhere. What happened? Where did she go?" "Maybe Madman Stan got her," Richie whimpered. Billy looked up at his parents and nodded his head. "Yeah, sure," he said, as a malicious smile spread across his face. "Madman Stan must have gotten her." One bright, moonlit night in a small Yorkshire village, a postman named Mr. Mullins was on his way home. As he was walking past the graveyard, something caught his attention. He noticed a luminous, glowing light coming from one of the graves. It was the fresh grave of a villager by the name of Peters, who had recently died. When he looked closer, he realized that it was a large, slimy blob that was crawling out of the grave, and it was wriggling back and forth as it emerged. It looked like a huge, luminous maggot. The ghastly thing seemed to exude pure evil. With a mixture of horror and fascination, Mr. Mullins watched as the maggot slithered along the ground, leaving a gleaming trail of disgusting slime behind it. Snaking in and out around the tombstones, the monstrous thing crawled out of the graveyard, and when it came to the vicar's house nearby, it disappeared from sight. The following day, Mullins told his wife and his best friend about his chilling experience. That night, the three of them decided to go down to the graveyard. They wanted to see if they could figure out what the hideous apparition might be. They waited and waited, and just as it had the night before, the dreadful worm oozed out of Peter's grave and made its way out of the cemetery. As they watched, the thing crawled to the door of the vicar's house again and disappeared. The next day, the Mullinses and their friend got a severe shock when they heard the vicar and his entire family had suddenly become seriously ill. As the hours ticked by, their condition grew worse and worse, and by sunset, the vicar and his entire family were dead. The doctor who examined them said they had died of ptomaine poisoning, which is a type of poisoning that can be caused by exposure to a putrefying corpse. Mullins, his wife, and their friend were more determined than ever to get to the bottom of the horrible apparition's origin. After dark that night, they ventured once again to the village graveyard to keep watch. Again, the hideous glowing maggot wriggled out of the grave and slithered between the tombstones, leaving a trail of slime in its wake. This time, as they followed it, they saw it go to the house of the village blacksmith. When it got to the front door, it suddenly vanished. The next morning, the blacksmith and his whole family became ill, and just like the vicar and his family, they died before sunset of ptomaine poisoning. Frightened and more baffled than ever, Mullins and his companions decided to keep watch again that night, but nothing happened. Although they were relieved, they decided to continue their nightly vigil at the graveyard for at least another week, just in case. 10 nights after they had first seen its appearance, the glowing maggot emerged from the grave again and crawled out of the graveyard. Mr. and Mrs. Mullins realized, to their horror, that it was going in the direction of their house. They followed it, and when the maggot got to the front door of their house, it disappeared. The couple were horrified, and they ran into their house. Looking around, they found no trace of the maggot, and when they went upstairs, they found their 5-year-old son sleeping peacefully in his bed. The couple breathed a sigh of relief and went back downstairs. The next morning, however, when Mullins and his wife went to wake their son, they found that he was extremely sick. The little boy was seized by a fit of vomiting, and within an hour, he was dead. Stricken with grief and filled with anger, Mullins and his wife wanted revenge. The grave the maggot had crawled out of was the grave of a man named Peters. After asking around, they found out that, in life, he had been a mean, vicious, and detestable man. He had made life miserable for his neighbors, and he had a particular dislike of both the vicar and the blacksmith. That night they paid another visit to the graveyard, and this time they were armed with shovels and gasoline. They dug up the grave of Peters, pulled out the coffin, and cracked open the lid. Holding up a lantern, they peered inside and saw the face of a corpse. Mr. Peters grinned back at them. His body had not decayed at all, and there was a look of malevolence and intense evil frozen on his twisted face. They took one look at him and slammed the lid down in horror. After regaining their nerve, they dragged the coffin to a nearby field, threw back the lid, and poured gasoline all over the corpse. Mullins struck a match and threw it on the corpse, which then burst into flames. Mullins and his wife stood there watching the blaze until the coffin and the corpse inside were reduced to ashes. After scattering his remains with a shovel and sprinkling them with holy water, they returned to the grave and filled it in again. Although they kept a vigil for several days afterwards, the strange, glowing maggot of doom was never seen again. The mansion had belonged to the Eldridge family for centuries. Ambrose Eldridge had lived there alone for most of his life. He was a shy and reclusive old man, and he had shut himself up in the mansion. No one had seen him for years. When he died, the mansion went to his closest living relative, his nephew, Ellison. After the funeral, Ellison went to the lawyer's office and signed all the necessary papers. He then received the deed to his ancestral home. The mansion was now his to do with as he pleased, and he decided that he would like to live there. On the day he moved in, he unlocked the front door and stepped into the dusty old mansion. It was filled with antique furniture and priceless heirlooms. He wandered through the halls, admiring the paintings of his ancestors which adorned the walls. That night, after going through the house, Ellison took a flashlight and decided to explore the large marble structure that lay behind the house. It was the family mausoleum, and generation after generation of Eldridges had been buried there. When he entered, Ellison saw that the mausoleum contained all of his ancestors, stretching back over 400 years. There were separate chambers, and in each of them there was a coffin containing the moldering body of a distant dead relative. As the days passed by, Ellison found himself visiting the mausoleum again and again. It was quiet and peaceful there. He liked the idea that this was the place where he would be buried when he died. One evening, he was shocked to discover that one of the coffins had been opened. It was the coffin belonging to his uncle Ambrose. When he lifted the lid and peered inside, he saw something that sent a chill right through him. The old man's coffin had been desecrated, and his body had been mutilated. His torso had been ripped open, and most of his guts were missing. Parts of his flesh had been torn away. All over his skin were the unmistakable marks of human teeth. It was almost too terrible to even believe. Someone or something had been feasting on him. Ellison was horrified. He ran back to the mansion and called the police. A few minutes later, 2 policemen arrived and took a look around. After asking some questions, they shrugged their shoulders and told him that there was nothing that they could do. The next morning, Ellison drove into town. He went to the local hunting supply shop and bought an enormous steel trap, big enough to catch a human being. He brought it home and he placed it in the tomb, setting the trap near the entrance so that the big steel teeth would immediately snap shut on anyone who trespassed. He then returned to the mansion and went to bed, falling into a troubled sleep. At some point during the night, he was awakened by the sound of movement outside. He scrambled out of bed, grabbed his flashlight, and went to check if anything had been disturbed. When he got to the mausoleum, Ellison shone his flashlight around. He saw that the steel trap had been carefully moved away from the entrance. Stepping inside, he discovered that his uncle's coffin had been opened again, and more of the body had been devoured. One of the eyes was missing, and the other was hanging from its socket. Most of the flesh had been stripped from the face, exposing the skull underneath. Somehow, the ghoul had gotten to the body again. Ellison immediately ran back to the mansion and called the police. He informed them about what had happened and demanded that they do something about it. The very next day, 2 policemen arrived as they were assigned to guard the mausoleum. That night, while the policemen were walking around outside in the cold, patrolling the grounds, Ellison was sitting by the fireside reading a book. After a while, he began to doze off. All of a sudden, he was awoken by the sound of shouting, and when he opened his eyes, he found himself blinking in the glare of a flashlight. In a daze, Ellison looked around. He was inside of the mausoleum. The policemen were standing at the door, shining their flashlights on him, and their faces looked grim. Ellison looked down and realized he was standing over the coffin of his Uncle Ambrose. "What's going on?" he tried to say, but there was something in his mouth, something soft and chewy. To his horror, he realized that, in his hands, he was clutching the half-eaten remains of a human heart. It was almost midnight when they drove down the crooked, lonely country road and stopped outside of the old log cabin. A chilly wind was blowing, and the moon was full. The boy and girl stepped out of the car and made their way towards the cabin. They opened the door and peered inside. "Is this it?" she asked. "Yeah," he replied. "This is the place. Let's go in." "You first," she said. He stepped inside and she followed. The door creaked shut and the darkness closed in around them. "Did you know that tonight is supposedly the darkest night of the year?" he asked. "No," she said. "Is it?" "Yeah, they call it the Blackest Night. Do you know why?" She shook her head no. "Okay, I'll tell you. It was about 20 years ago. Even back then, the cabin was abandoned and falling apart. Sometimes it was used by hunters who were going out to hunt game in the surrounding woods. It was also used as a makeout place by some of the young couples, kind of like us. Anyway, they say this broken down shack has seen a lot of hugs and kisses, but that all came to an end one cold October morning." "What happened?" she asked. "They found the body of a young girl inside the cabin. She'd been murdered, and I guess it was an extremely brutal scene. They said that her eyes had been gouged out and that she was gutted like a fish. I guess her body was ripped open from her belly up to her chin. They say her guts were strewn out all around the cabin, and the killer also chopped off one of her hands. They say that she bled to death. I guess it was slow and painful." "How horrible!" the girl exclaimed. "Why are you telling me this?" "Well, that's how the story goes," he said. "The murderer was never found, and they say that ever since then, the cabin has been haunted. Every year on the darkest night of the year, on the night that this terrible crime took place, they say that if you listen very closely, you can hear the screams of the dying girl, and that's why they call it the blackest night of the year." "You're making all of this up just to scare me." "No, not at all," he replied. "I swear it's the truth," he said solemnly. But she could see a hint of a mischievous smile popping up on his lips. "You never heard of this legend? I thought everybody knew about it." No, I've never heard it before, she said. This place is giving me the creeps. Let's get out of here. Oh, come on, this is interesting. Look, if you would have told me all this before, I would have never agreed to come here. And the thought of that poor girl crying and screaming, I don't even want to think about it. Hey, shh, be quiet, the boy said. Let's wait a little longer. Maybe we'll hear her scream. I don't want to, she protested. I'm already trembling like a leaf. Well, I'm the one with the car, he said. Maybe I'll just go off and leave you, and you can spend the night here alone. No, she cried. Don't even joke about that. She grabbed the door handle and pulled. The rusty hinges creaked, and the handle came off in her hand. She let out a shriek of surprise, and her surprise turned to panic, and she began pushing and shoving and banging on the door, but it wouldn't open. Is this your idea of a joke? Did you do this? She cried, as her eyes began to well up with tears. Come on, this isn't funny. Let me out. The boy didn't answer. The girl then turned around, and she saw him standing there in the moonlight, a faceless black silhouette. Are you scared yet? He asked sarcastically. She looked down at his hands. He was unscrewing his right hand, turning it around and around. He pulled it off, revealing a rusty metal hook. What is happening? She cried. As he got closer, she saw that he looked much, much older. His hair wasn't blonde anymore. It was gray, and his face was lined and wrinkled. I love this night, he said. It's a shame that it only comes once a year. No, she begged. Please don't. For 20 years, they've been coming out here, he said. The faces change, but the girls are always the same. Silly, naive, vulnerable, and stupid, waiting for me. No, she whispered as her knees buckled and she slid to the floor. He grinned down at her. This is my night, he said as he raised his hook. On that cold October night, the lonely cabin was filled again with the horrifying sound of a girl's screams. The eerie sounds were carried on the breeze, and those who heard them looked fearfully into the darkness, then hurried home to tell their loved ones about the terrible legend of the blackest night of the year. A young family with one child moved into a new house. The child is a boy, 3 years old. The mother is in the basement one day doing laundry. She hears the boy in the next room playing. She hears him talking and goes to see what he is doing. The boy's standing there looking at a wall and talking away as if someone were there. The mother asks to whom he is talking, and the boy replies, "The sticky man." The parents just think that the boy has invented an imaginary friend. He often tells them he was playing with or talking to the sticky man, not just in the basement, but all over the house. The boy talks about the sticky man so much that the parents begin to get concerned. They explain to the boy that it's okay to have imaginary friends, but he needs to understand that the sticky man is not real. This begins to make the boy very upset, and he insists that the sticky man is real. The parents try to teach their son the difference between real and imaginary things. One day the boy says, The sticky man is getting mad at you because you keep saying that he's not real. And the parents finally tell him that he must stop talking about the sticky man. The boy continues on and keeps saying that they're making the sticky man mad. One day, the boy is standing at the top of the stairs to the basement, and he starts to jump up and down, clapping his hands and saying, "The sticky icky man is coming! The sticky icky man is coming!" The boy won't stop, and his mother gets very upset with him. The boy then says that the sticky icky man is in the basement and that he is mad. The mother begins to become scared in regard to her son's strange behavior. She decides to go down to the basement to show him that no one is down there. Down the stairs and into the laundry room she goes. And when she looks around, she sees something on the far wall. There's mold all over the basement wall, and a gray ooze is dripping down from what seems like a large hole in the wall. The mother goes closer to investigate it. It seems to her like the hole has been eaten into the wall. There are bite marks all around the edges, and it's covered in slippery goop. The goo is flowing down from the hole, and she can hear the drip, drip, drip of the gray, odorless liquid falling and splattering on the basement floor. She can hear her son sitting at the top of the stairs chanting, "The sticky man is here! The sticky man is here! The sticky man is here!" A small droplet of slime splashes on the top of her head. She looks up. A huge brown, oozing, moving, bubbling, slithering shape is clinging to the ceiling of the basement. Sticky goo and ooze is falling in droplets off of its hideous, moldy body and forming puddles on the floor. Its face resembles a human, and its evil eyes bubble and shift, staring angrily at her. The thing forms a sort of mouth, and it opens it wide, leering at her. Suddenly, slimy tentacles of ooze reach out to grab her. The mother screams and races up the basement stairs. The sticky thing on the ceiling oozes towards the door, trying to get there before her. She grabs her young son as she runs, and just about makes it to the door as the thing is flowing down the wall like slime to cut off her exit. She slams the basement door shut and locks it. Her son is still chanting, "The sticky man is here! The sticky man is here!" She backs away from the door, her son still clutched tightly in her arms. She sees the ooze pushing its way under the door. The door is creaking, straining at its hinges as a huge force behind it tries to push it down. The woman shifts her grip on her son, turns, and runs out of the house. The woman refuses to go back into the house. The family sold it as fast as possible and moved to another town. They never told the new owners about what had happened, and their son never mentioned the sticky man again, and eventually seemed to forget all about this period in his life. In time, the couple had another baby, a little girl this time. On the little girl's 3rd birthday, her parents threw a party for her and sent invites to all of the kids in her class. The girl blows out the candles on her birthday cake, and everyone asks her to sing a song for them. The girl stands up in the chair and starts chanting, "The sticky man is coming, the sticky man is coming, sticky man is coming, sticky man is coming." There was a 16-year-old boy named Christophe who lived in France. He was obsessed with brand-name clothing and refused to wear anything else. Every garment in his wardrobe bore the label of a famous designer. He had Lacoste polo shirts, Abercrombie & Fitch t-shirts, Tommy Hilfiger sweatshirts, and a Hugo Boss jacket. His shirts were made by Armani, his ties were from Ralph Lauren, and his underwear was all Calvin Klein. He also had Louis Vuitton belts, Levi's jeans, Gucci shoes, and Nike sneakers. His parents spoiled him and bought him everything that he wanted. They both worked hard in order to earn enough money to satisfy their son's expensive tastes. It had been years since they bought any new clothes for themselves. However, Christoph was selfish and never appreciated the sacrifices they made for him. One day he told them he needed a new pair of sneakers. That evening, they returned from the local department store and handed him a bag. Christoph snatched it from their hands without even saying thank you. When he opened it and looked inside, he suddenly flew into a fury. "Merde, you idiots!" he shouted angrily. "Putain, how could you be so stupid?" "What, Christoph?" asked his mother timidly. "What's wrong? Are they the wrong size?" Christoph was seething with anger. "Merde, they're the wrong color," he snapped. "These are blue. I asked you for red. Putain, I specifically said red Nikes." "Couldn't you just try these ones on?" his father begged. "Perhaps you would like them." Boiling with rage, Christoph picked up one of the sneakers and slapped his father across the face with it. "Merde!" he screamed. "I said red, not blue. You expect me to wear blue sneakers? Putain! You old fool! Putain! I wouldn't be caught dead in these things. Take them away and burn them." He threw the sneakers at his parents and slammed his bedroom door. The next day, Christoph was walking through the park when he spotted a young boy who was wearing an eye-catching pair of white Nike sneakers. "Merde," said Christoph to himself. "I've never seen Nikes like that anywhere in France. Putain, they must be a U.S. model that he had custom-made and ordered online. I have to have them." He looked around and saw a heavy tree branch lying in the grass. Picking it up, he made his way across the park to the bench where the boy was sitting. Christoph approached quietly, sneaking up behind the boy. He raised the piece of wood above him and brought it crashing down on the boy's head. Then he pounced on the dazed boy and began kicking and punching him violently until the youth was no longer moving. Christoph was breathing heavily and adrenaline was pumping through his veins. He began unlacing the boy's white Nikes and pulled them off. Just as he was putting the sneakers on his own feet, he heard shouts coming from behind him. Looking over his shoulder, he saw a policeman shouting and running towards him. Christoph stopped lacing up the sneakers and took off running. He dashed out of the park, closely followed by the policeman. He jumped over bushes and dodged through alleyways, trying to lose his pursuer, but whenever he looked back, the policeman was still hot on his heels. Just then, Christoph saw a railway station. He ran through the door and hurried out onto the platform. The train was just about to arrive. When he glanced behind him, he saw the policeman coming through the door. Christoph jumped off the platform and landed on the tracks. Scrambling to his feet, he tried to cross the railway line before the train came, but the laces of the stolen Nikes became entangled in the rails. He tripped and fell onto the tracks. Christoph looked up just in time to see the train bearing down on him. It ran right across his legs and cut his feet off at the ankles. The horrified policeman saw everything that happened and immediately called an ambulance. The terribly injured boy was rushed to the hospital. He was bleeding profusely, and the doctors were worried that he wouldn't make it. After the ambulance left, the policeman went out onto the tracks. He collected Kristoff's severed feet and dropped them into a plastic bag. The feet were still inside the Nike sneakers, which had turned red after being stained with Kristoff's blood. Aiden was a popular boy, and on the day of his funeral, nearly everyone in town showed up to pay their last respects. His father held back tears as he thought about how his son would never grow up to have children of his own. His mother cried bitterly as she remembered the day that he was born. Aiden had been her only child, and she would gladly have given her life to save his. The school teacher grew misty-eyed as she remembered Aiden's smiling face. Every morning, he had placed a shiny new apple on her desk. A girl in his class wept bitterly as she wondered how life could be so cruel. Aiden had been her first crush. His next-door neighbor slumped in his seat as he thought about how empty and quiet the neighborhood would be now that Aiden was gone. The old woman who lived down the street wiped away a tear and pondered her own mortality. Aiden called to her house many times to run errands for her. The local shopkeeper sighed as he recalled how Aiden had bought candy at his shop nearly every day and often shared it with the younger children. The priest recited a silent prayer as they lowered the coffin into the grave. He thought about how Aiden had always stayed behind after Mass on Sundays to help him collect the prayer books. The butcher frowned as he wondered what exactly was in the coffin. He had spent the night before carefully chopping up Aiden's body and putting it on display in his shop window. There was a young woman who decided to visit a psychic because she was curious about what life had in store for her. Although she didn't really believe in fortune-telling, she thought it would be fun to have her fortune told. She arrived at the psychic's house and was greeted at the door by an old lady in a ragged shawl. The psychic ushered her inside and led her down the hallway to a darkened room. They then sat down at a table. "Can you really tell my future?" asked the woman. "Of course," the psychic replied. "Just show me your palm." The woman held out her hand, and the psychic examined it closely, frowning in concentration. There was a long silence, and the young woman became uncomfortable. Suddenly, the psychic went very pale in the face and gave the woman a strange look. "Is there something wrong?" the woman asked nervously. The psychic refused to answer any questions and told the woman it was late and she wanted to go home. There would be no charge for the palm reading. The woman was worried and began asking questions, but no matter how much she begged, the psychic wouldn't say a word. The woman kept insisting, but the psychic just kept shaking her head and saying that the session was over. Finally, when the young woman began to grow angry, the psychic relented. She took out a pen and paper and wrote something down. Then she folded it up, put it into an envelope, and handed it to the young woman. "Do not read this until you get home tonight," she said. The woman was relieved and stuffed her envelope in her pocket. She thanked the psychic and paid her for her services. They said their goodbyes and the woman left, thinking about the mysterious note and wondering what it could possibly contain. As the woman crossed the road, she was still deep in thought. She wasn't looking where she was going and walked right into the path of an oncoming car. The vehicle slammed into the woman, tossing her in the air like a rag doll. Her broken body bounced along the road a few times, finally coming to rest in a crumpled and motionless heap. The police arrived and pronounced the poor woman dead on the scene. While rifling through her pockets looking for identification, an officer came across the envelope. He opened it and read the note inside, which contained only 4 words. "You have no future." Well, there you have it, boys and ghouls. Terrifying Tales, Volume 2. We hope that you've enjoyed these short, scary stories. Take care of yourselves out there. We'll see you in the next episode. We hope that these stories have helped you feel rested and relaxed, and hopefully you won't have too bad of nightmares. Sweet dreams.